Hello, it's lovely to be with you this afternoon. What I'd like to do today in the time that I have is really to start with what's happening in this picture. And I want to talk to you about what's going on here. I think it starts with objects, it starts with people, it starts with storytelling, and it starts with all this joy in the museum that I think we all recognise. So I'm a researcher based at the University of Leicester in the UK in the Museum Studies department. And a lot of my work is focused on understanding what's going on in this picture. And it's focused on understanding the community engagement work of the museum. How we can make sure that the museum becomes a more inclusive, participatory and accessible space. And within this, I'm really focused on the skills and the practice of those professionals who are doing this engagement work in the museum, and you might recognise yourself in that particular group. What I'd like to talk to you about today in this short presentation, and I wanted to take a quick opportunity again to thank the organisers for their kind contributions and to thank all the speakers who've come before me who've really set out a really inspirational day. What I want to do is to present some ideas around museums and care that I've been thinking about for probably the last 10 years. And I'm hoping that you'll find something in this talk that maybe provokes or stretches your own thinking in your own context. And much of what I'd like to share today is found in my recent book, The Museum as a Space of Social Care. The book is in large part about the work of Tyne and Wear Archives and Museums, which is a large local authority museum in the northeast of England. That has a long tradition of pioneering social inclusion work, often working with the most vulnerable and marginalised communities. And the book is a proposal to view museum work as care work. So on the surface, I suppose, what I'm saying is probably very uncontroversial. Museums have always been about the care of objects. But what I'm interested in thinking through in this book is what happens if we extend seriously the notion of care to the whole of a museum, to its different functions and to its different professional work. So we think about both taking care of objects and we start talking about taking care of people. And in particular, taking care of those people who are in the most need of care, those with the most vulnerabilities in our societies. And this thinking is also linked to the growth of the movement of museums, health and wellbeing in the last year in the UK in particular, but also globally. And Victoria Hume and other delegates have spoken to this expansion of creative health work. So as an intellectual but also a practical contribution, what the book attempts to do is to offer up this idea of care thinking. And that's what I'd like to talk a little bit more detail with you today. As the title suggests, another thing the book does is to develop the idea of a museum as a space of social care, one that is connected into networks of community support organisations as a link in a chain of caring institutions. So what I'm talking about, I think, just bounces off what the previous speaker was talking about, which is about stretching the form or the shape of the museum into something other than its original intent, perhaps, but also reconnecting it, perhaps, to the particular recognition of its civic role. So there's three elements of care thinking that together, for me, shape the idea of a museum as a space of care that I'd like to speak with you today. And scale is going to be important here. What I'm going to do in my talk is to move from the micro, so to look a little bit at the intimate relations and practices of care between people and between people and objects, to think at a broader level about the kind of organizational matters of caring cultures, and then to move right up to the macro and start thinking about care ethics and thinking about care as the broader work of society. And I guess it's through these three elements we might together reimagine the museum, its work, its wider functions, but also its wider societal role. So to start with an idea then, I might propose or offer a definition to anchor a shared understanding of care for us today. Theories of care and definitions of care work have traditionally been found in the nursing literature, as well as in feminist writings about family care, so particularly thinking about the caring work of mothers. But since at least the 1980s, there's been a real expansion in scholarship. So we now find writing on care work in all sorts of contexts, from farming to politics to policy, and across all kinds of different types of work and occupation. And I suppose my modest contribution is to start locating this explicitly in the museum. And I take as a starting point a definition by a geography scholar, David Conradson, who's actually drawing on positive psychology to describe care as the proactive interest of one person in the well-being of another and the articulation of that interest in practical ways. So this implies action. It implies a reaching out from ourselves and towards another. To understand care, we need to look at the museum up close, in the everyday and mundane practices of the museum. And we need to look at the felt qualities of the museum experience, at the deep emotion work performed by staff, as well as to pay attention to the materialities that support care. So some of this is about museum objects, and Brendan Coa's talk earlier was a real kind of overview of that in exciting ways. And I think it's also about museum spaces and their particular architectures. So what I want to argue is that there's something very specific about the museumness of care, about the care that happens in the museum. And I think we do well to think about that quite deeply. So to start our journey of care thinking, we must fundamentally pay attention to and better understand relations of care as they take shape in the museum. So you may later ask yourself, what does care look like in your own museum practice? What does it look like in your day-to-day work at that very everyday level? To understand care, it's also useful for me to say a few words about how care is defined elsewhere in more substantial ways. And here I turn to American political theorist Joan Tronto. She describes 4 phases that together shape good care. Attentiveness, this idea of caring about, noticing the unmet caring needs of another. The idea of responsibility, caring for, taking on the responsibility or burden of meeting those needs. Competence of caregiving, so the actual work of care. And responsiveness, care receiving, checking that caring needs have been met. Now, this last part is really significant. Care is a mutual accomplishment, and someone has to recognize care for it to be meaningful. Otherwise, we risk that care becomes patronizing, and it can be manipulative, it can be dangerous. And indeed, there's many important critiques of care and welfare, and we should today also probably be talking about its dangers. Caring requires that we start with the standpoint of a person requiring care, and that we respond on their terms, that we check that their caring needs have been met. Otherwise, we really risk entering into a really patronizing space of care. So back to this image from the beginning of my talk then, part of my work has been about understanding these types of scenes in the museum. What makes them significant and meaningful? What's happening here? How can care help us articulate this particular power of the museum? In the book, I go on to describe the practice of care in the museum about providing emotional support through listening, through encouragement, through compassion and kindness, through providing practical support by offering opportunities for people to develop creative skills, confidence and interest, while all the time being sensitive to access and other practical needs. These practices support spaces of care in the museum that are made up of a multitude of ordinary yet sensitive caring acts, such as taking the time to share cups of tea, making small talk and listening, gently holding a person's hand, and generally being friendly and approachable. And I think that these are the realities of care. Part of where these different impacts come from that were presented in earlier evidence reviews, such as Karen Mack's talk, I think we also should speak of those everyday realities of care, and look to these scenes as what social prescribing might feel and look like. These are programs that are attentive as well as focused on dignity and respect, where care isn't patronizing, but rather starts from a position that we all need care, but that caring needs are not evenly distributed. We may need more care or less care at different times, and there are always power imbalances in caring relations. But thinking about what creates good care here is critical. We do really well to recognize in ourselves times when we have needed care and what that good care has felt like, and equally leaning into our experiences of when we've received bad care and think through those to help us shape programs that put people and their needs on their own terms at the heart of museums that centre inclusion and equity. So over the last 7 years in the UK, much of the care work of the museum can also be understood in action through the growth of the last 8 years of an area of practice that's been broadly defined as museums, health and wellbeing. There's some reports on this slide, and the one I wanted to highlight is actually the same as Victoria Hume highlighted. This publication recently published by the Baring Foundation, which brings together 16 case studies of museums that are taking the lead in supporting mental health through museum activities. Some of these include museums with specialist mental health collections, and some of them, but the broad majority of them, 13 of the case studies out of 16, are museums with a range of different collections, from art to social history to industrial collections, and using a whole range of different objects to support mental health. And I do encourage you to look through those if to kind of follow that interest through. From this work and the examples in the UK, what seems to be important in sustaining and embedding programs is about identifying need strategically, about recognizing vulnerabilities in local communities to establish priorities in programming, or identifying strengths in your particular staff and your collections to establish who you might be working with. There's some kind of specialization. In the book, my main case study is Tyne and Wear Archives and Museums, and what's interesting in the example of that institution is that they've really prioritized and strategically developed their health and wellbeing provision. They recognize that they have limited capacity and that their capacity is best invested in strategic, meaningful ways. So they've developed 3 main health and wellbeing programs. One of them is supporting people living with mental ill health. Another program is supporting people in recovery from addiction and people who are part of the criminal justice system. And a third program is called the Platinum Program and is for people aged over 55 and people who may have dementia. So the other thing that I think is really significant about this work is also to think through that something that's always important in a museum is about representation. So where there are opportunities for these projects to also feed back into display, to feed back into the stories and narratives of the museums, I think this is where we also see the power of museums in the sphere of care. Another kind of idea in the care thinking triad is that we do well, and it is important to pause and reflect, and to recognise that there are emotional costs to all this caregiving work. It can be both rewarding but extremely exhausting at the same time for those museum professionals who deliver this work. Care work has historically been undervalued and underpaid, and we risk seeing this in the museum as well. This is a new area of work for museums, and there are still issues of training, issues of boundary management, and issues of support. So we need, if we're talking about care work, to think about the wider cultures of care across organisations that can support this work. What is the wider responsibility of museum managers, for example, who want to promote this work? How do they care for their staff who are delivering this work of care? I said I would also move across scales, and this final element of care thinking that I wanted to present in this short talk is about care ethics, about a wider moral philosophy centering care at the heart of society's work. Bernice Fisher and Joan Tronto provide this really expansive and capacious definition of care, which is one that I return to often. They state that on the most general level, caring can be viewed as a species of activities that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which interweave in a complex, self-sustaining web. So if we start here, we might really be able to reimagine the museum in expansive ways. Care thinking might provide us with a new set of coordinates, a new set of logics to think about the work of the museum today and post-COVID-19. And I think what's useful about hanging on to the idea of care, it's also a way of recognising and critiquing aspects of our society that we might find care as lacking. So many would say that we are facing a crisis of care. We have together seen the newspaper headlines about a loneliness epidemic, headlines that report on studies that have shown that loneliness is likely to increase your risk of death by 26%. We've also seen the newspaper headlines about mental health being the greatest burden on care systems. And it's projected that by 2030, mental health problems, particularly depression, will be the leading cause of mortality globally. But at the very same time, we also have to recognise that our societies continue to undervalue the essential work of care. And we are indeed perhaps facing a crisis of care, much like we are facing an ecological crisis, which in any case are linked. But equally, I'm so positive to be in this space with you all today to share thoughts and hear about your own work of reimagining museums as spaces of care, responding to communities, their needs and their vulnerabilities. To think about health and well-being and the links between culture and healing. It's a shame I can't be with you today, but I welcome you to continue this conversation about how we might think or globally rethink the museum as a space of care. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of this conference together.
Thank you very much, Nuala. One thing we're definitely missing in Greece, and I see it from all the presentations, is the collection of evidence, not only but case studies, actually publishing and making known this, well, the idea of museums as a space of care, but what is already happening, and basically sharing the knowledge around this. Do we have any questions for Nuala? I don't have my phone. Do we have any questions from the chat? One question over there. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Nuala. Thank you very much for your very interesting overview of care in museums. It's extremely helpful. Being also a professional, an academic training students in museum studies, my question is, how do we rethink the training of museum studies students within the framework of care for museums? Because caring in the museum context is multi-layered, and of course it's based on caring for objects, caring for people. How much more complex the training of students has become?
Thank you for that question. And I think it's a really important question. It's a question that I ask myself as a teacher of museum studies as well. And we have students that come to Leicester from all across the globe to train as museum professionals. And I don't think maybe we don't do it enough, but now is a really good time to start thinking about how do we prepare the next generation as well of museum professionals to think about the skills and competencies that they might need to enter into these caring spaces. I think what's key from the museum perspective and as educators is that we work in partnership with a range of health and social care professionals to think about those skills and competencies that are needed. So I'm thinking about, it's also about caregiving, but also about protecting our students and our museum staff to feel well at work and to feel able to work in these health and social care contexts that can be complex, that can be about end of life care, that might be about chronic, helping people to work through chronic health conditions. And we really do need to think about that kind of impact that it has on people working in those environments for a really long time.
Thank you. Thank you, Nuala. I think we're going to move to our next speaker. Thank you very much, and hope all the best for the next of the year.